Okay, hi everybody, this is episode 18, and before we get into episode 18, I'm down here with my biggest fan, Edie, our granddaughter, and she comes over to see our trains every once in a while, and because she likes to watch them and what Pop Pop has been doing, and she's got some things that she wants to tell everybody.
Well, I have one and it has a blue heart and this on it and this and I have gloves and it has a picture of, and it's special because I got it from Wandering Oakens. Wandering Oakens ordered it from a different shop at Disney.
Yeah, you got it from Disney.
And it had to fly a long way.
Yeah, because you went to Disney World not long ago.
And I got a special oranges and the elf so just to come to go together with it. And this one Zoe gave to me.
Zoe gave it to your cousin. Yeah. Do you want to say anything about the trains?
And there's static glass, which I don't like.
Oh.
But because it got me a little splinter right here.
Oh, you got static glass splinter.
But it came out all by itself.
Yeah.
But look.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think of those trees and the scenery here?
I like the mountains and the blue sky the best because it has lots of grass and dirt and probably a little bit of sand and I like the blue sky part because it's really pretty blue. It also matches with my wand blue. And I have a violet dress which has a picture of Rapunzel on it and it's real pretty and it's real good. Yeah. And I love it and I love how it matches to their
Okay, so with that, with my biggest critic and my biggest fan, we're going to get into episode 18 and I'm going to talk about how we make the landforms. Say goodbye to everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, welcome to episode 18. In this episode, we're going to talk about building the foreground scenery of the layout. Last time we were talking about the forced perspective, the compression of distance I did with the backdrop, but now we're going to be working on foreground scenery, which is going to be more one-to-one. Very little compression, a little bit of compression towards the back, forced perspective, but not much. And now we're really bringing in the scenery, the sense in which it really occurs, and this is where understanding the geomorphology of how this landform occurs makes it look realistic. Because if you want to create scenery that looks like believable, you have to make scenery in light of the geomorphology that resulted in it. So for that reason, I'm going to get a little bit into the geomorphology of this part of California right here before I actually get into layout. I'm also going to be showing you some pictures from other people's layouts about how the scenery makes for a very effective presentation. But this first slide, this first graphic here I'm giving you, this is the overall geology of California. Obviously there's a lot jumbled there, but I'm going to be concentrating on an area in the southern portion of the state. And if you look on this next graphic, what I'm going to be modeling is the kind of geography you get when you have continental plates that are subducting ocean plates. And as you can see from this graphic, it shows the trench, the subduction zone, and another graphic here that focuses in on exactly the cross-section geologically of what's happening in this portion of California. And the Farallon plate, which is the Pacific Ocean plate, the Farallon plate is being subducted under the North American plate, and it's forming the coastal range, which we call an accretionary wedge, which is basically that bulldozed portion of the Pacific Ocean plate out ahead of the North American plate, and then the Great Valley, the Four Arc Basin, which actually is the San Joaquin Valley. in California. This is a very characteristic geologic formation, and then of course into the Sierra Nevadas. And if we look at this other map of California, this fourth graphic, we're looking at the North American plate there and the Pacific Ocean plate and the San Andreas Fault. That's a name that is famous to a lot of people, and we're looking at just north of what we call the transverse ranges, and that black line you see going off in the graphic to the east, that's the Garlock Fault. Well, it's the intersection of the San Andreas and the Garlock Fault that basically determines the geography that you're seeing on this portion of the layout. Now, something to mention about the San Andreas Fault and the Garlock Fault. They are what are called right lateral strike slip faults. These faults move laterally as opposed to vertically, and there's a locking action that occurs in faults when they move in that direction that causes them to build up energy, and earthquakes along lateral strike slip faults tend to be pretty severe because there's a lot of energy buildup. And if you go to this next graphic, this is a close-up of the area that actually in which the Tehachapi Mountains are located. And if you notice the Garlock Fault heading off to the east, and there's a compression zone, there's a locking action because the San Andreas Fault at this point takes kind of a southeasterly curve and then straightens out again, and it kind of forms like a doorstop. And you can see the Elsinore Fault and the San Jacinto Fault are subsidiary faults that are a result of this locking action, as is the Garlock Fault on the continental side of the San Andreas, whereas the Elsinore and San Jacinto are on the Pacific Ocean plate side. And so this is a geologically a very high stress area, and the terrain that you get around it is very indicative of this. And I've got just a few photos here of actually the surface trace of the San Andreas Fault. You can see the gentleman standing here looking actually down into the San Andreas Fault, and he is standing on the North American plate side of the fault, and immediately to his left, that surface is there. That's actually the Pacific Ocean plate side of the fault. There's a couple other images here, aerial images, that show the trace of the San Andreas Fault. It's very visible. You can walk right up to it. You can look at it. You can see it. It's something to observe, and it's a physical feature, and it's really there. Now, what does this mean for the railroad? Well, this has not been the easiest area to build a railroad through, and this final image that I've got shows the earthquake of 1954 and some of the damage it did to the Southern Pacific Main Line through the Tehachapi Mountains. And if you look at that track, that was not track that was laid in that way. That track was actually bent and distorted by the action of the San Andreas and the Garlock Fault. Again, this is a right lateral strike slip fault, and there's a lot of force that's released when these things slip, when they finally get that tension relieved on them. And so this is a constant awareness of these geologic forces at work in this railroad. And one of the details I'll add that I haven't added to this section here is the railroads put in a lot of automatic rock slide and slide detection features along their line because they know they're in a very seismically active area. Now, what I'd like to transition to here, I've got a series of presentations of graphics, and I want to bring in talk about how creating realistic scenery is really important to the believability of a model railroad. And the first model railroad I'm going to talk about here is an example of real world. And I mentioned that there are basically people who build model railroads exactly copying a real railroad in a real place at a real time. And then there are those, which I'm the group, that want to capture the flavor of a real railroad, but they're not homing in on exactly an exact location. And then there are people who build fictitious railroads in real geography. Okay. And then there are people, which the last one I'll talk about is actually rather theatrical. I'll leave that for a moment. But these are basically the three approaches here. And the first one is a great layout. It's built by a man named Tony Kester, and he is modeling the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, otherwise known as the Nickel Plate. It was a real railroad, and you can see it on this map. And he is specifically modeling the area that is highlighted in red between Frankfort, Indiana, and Charleston, Illinois, because he grew up in that area, and he's modeling it in 1954. So all of these graphics that you're seeing are actual depictions of the Nickel Plate Railroad as it appeared in the geography in which it existed in 1954 when it was going through the transition from steam locomotives to diesel. And all of these scenes are faithful to geographic locations on his layout, and it's a rather extensive layout. All of the geographic locations really existed on the real railroad. The track diagrams and all the towns are consistent with the way they really were. The one thing that he's had to do is he's had to compress the distances, because even though this is a large model railroad layout, a home model railroad layout about twice the size of mine, it still would not be nearly big enough to depict it at exact proportion and scale to the real stretch of the railroad. You'd need to have probably something the size of an ice hockey rink to be able to house something that big. But he's captured all the towns and compressed the distances between them, and this is a faithful rendition of the Nickel Plate Railroad. The next one I'd like to go to is kind of got a little attachment to me. This is Paul Dolko's layout. It is a switching layout modeled on Baltimore Harbor in the 1950s. And it involves the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Western Maryland Railroad. And it accurately captures the feel of Baltimore, of South Baltimore and the Baltimore Harbor area where my family originated from, where I grew up not far from there. So this has got a real connection with it. And when I look at this, I really do see Baltimore in the 1950s. I'm old enough to remember what it looked like, and Paul has done a beautiful job in recreating a real world place. The next layout now I'll talk about. This is where I fall in model railroading interest. These pictures are by a man named Pelle Soberg, who's a Danish model railroader. He lives in Denmark. He gets over to the States fairly often, but like me, he is a big fan of the Union Pacific. But again, he's not creating the real places on the Union Pacific. What he wants to do is create the feel of the land that the Union Pacific runs through, so the Union Pacific depiction looks realistic. And Pelle Soberg's modeling is just incredible. It's awfully hard sometimes, as you can see from these images, to separate, am I looking at a model or am I looking at the real thing? And he does unbelievably beautiful work. But he's capturing the Union Pacific, and his focus is to capture the essence of the Union Pacific in the modern era. The next one I want to show is now in this group of building fictitious railroads in real geography, as opposed to railroads in fictitious geography. This is work by a man named Eric Bruman, and he has a railroad called the Utah Belt. It's a totally fictitious railroad, but it runs through real geography in New Mexico and southern Colorado. It's a fictional bridge line that connects other major railroads, provides interchange, and he has very faithfully covered the geography with a fictitious railroad. And Eric's effort is to go to hyper-realism, and he's even going to the extent of he is modeling the Utah Belt in real time. In other words, he's constantly updating his locomotive rosters and his equipment to reflect current modern railroad practices. So every year there's something that looks a little different on his railroad as he brings in new locomotives, new equipment, new operating practices. It's very interesting. And you can see he's made a very realistic looking fictitious railroad, a very believable railroad. You could believe the Utah Belt really exists as a real railroad. Another individual in the real geography imaginary railroad, this is a very prominent model railroad, is by Alan McClellan. It's called the Virginian in Ohio. Again, totally fictitious railroad. Combines elements of the Virginian Railroad and the Baltimore, Ohio, and Chesapeake, Ohio, and it's made to replicate an eastern coal hauling railroad, a big coal hauling railroad. And the Virginia and Ohio is set in real geography, but it's a fictitious railroad. And you can see from these images that the scenery surrounding this railroad, like all the others, really gives you the sense that yes, the Virginia and Ohio really did exist. Unfortunately, it didn't. It's not a real railroad. But again, all of this shows you the importance of making believable geography, believable scenery, whether it's a real railroad operating in it's actual geography or a fictitious railroad operating in real geography in a place, or a real railroad operating in nondescript geography to help capture its flavor. It's all important, and the scenery is really important to studying this. Now I want to go into one very, very special model railroad. There's a man named John Allen. Was born in 1913, passed away in 1973. He was a professional photographer and artist, and he lived in Monterey, California. And he created a railroad called the Gory and Defeated. Okay, and his railroad was totally fictitious, and the geography was totally fictitious. But John Allen has been called the Wizard of Monterey, because he was the person who really brought home making believable geography for a railroad. Even though in his case, you could say the geography was actually rather theatrical. He took the real essence of real world geography and pumped it up into almost like a play sets kind of thing, like sets for a Broadway play, to hyper raise the realism of the railroad, to make it look believable. And you can see from these images that he really did succeed in setting about creating a fascinating railroad. Interestingly, John Allen passed away in 1973, and less than a week after he passed away, an accidental fire destroyed his house in Monterey, and there was very little of the Gory and Defeated that survived the fire. There's only a few locomotives and collections, and none of the scenery, none of the layouts. So it's kind of a sad story. But even today, the Gory and Defeated is held as a very special place in model railroads. This is just a brief interlude. One of the things I wanted to mention the other day that I forgot when I was doing episode 17, which really does apply through all of the episodes we're going to do about scenery. And it's a trick that you have to focus on when you create scenery. And it applies no matter how big or small your layout is. I mean, you can take the traditional 4 by 8 foot sheet of plywood and put track on it, an oval or whatever shape, and watch trains go around and around. The train chases its tail. Which is why when it comes to scenery and creating a sense of place, what you want to create is a sense of a place that the train travels through. And one of the things that we face, even in HO scale, which has a proportion of roughly 1 to 87 inches in HO scale is 1 inch in real 1-to-1 life scale, is that even with a large space like I've got here, nearly 40 feet by 25 feet, you cannot fit the world in exactly as it is, even when you're modeling the real world. Even in the example of Tony Kester's beautiful nickel plate railroad layout, that's a long stretch of track, and you can't fit that in at 1-to-1 proportion, everything in there. So you have to condense stuff. And one of the ways that you condense it when it comes to scenery is that you create large scenic vignettes that the train moves through. Now, these videos that I showed, I'll just show a couple of them here from the start of the previous episode, demonstrates this. If you notice, beyond the area where the train is traveling, you see the tools and stuff of unfinished layout. If you take the time to step back and really look at what you're seeing my hand tools and supplies and everything on the unfinished portions of the benchwork where there's no scenery. But that's not really what you're concerned about. Your attention watching this is all focused on the train. And so what you try to create are these areas of vignettes that the train goes through that in your mind's eye, in your perception, oh, that's the real world. That's what the train is really going through. And of course, I mentioned forced perspective to create an appearance of objects being more distant by making them smaller. That's one trick that we do. Another is that realizing how people look at things. People have peripheral vision out to quite a range. I mean, I can see both my hands here in my peripheral vision. But what they really look at, what they really see, or pay attention to is we use a term in sensors, intelligence and weapon sensors, called field of regard. It's that area that the sensor is really looking down at, that within which something moves that gets its attention. Well, human perception is very much the same way. And in human perception, we have a field of regard that's about 60 degrees out like this. And if you think about it, those of us that wear glasses really appreciate this, because our glasses are generally sized side to side to mimic this field of regard of human vision for the area of our correction. It would not be practical to make it wider than that, in part because you couldn't use a limitation to how much correction you can crank into the lenses if you really make them really wide. So there's a compromise there. But if you want to get a sense of how this works, those of you that wear glasses, just look at your view of the world through glasses. Look at what you're looking at, and this is handy when you work on the layout, because I've always got these things. I put it this way: if I didn't wear these things, I couldn't even see the layout. So obviously, it's a necessity. But when I look at the layout through these, it establishes a field of regard, and I found it to be very handy in building scenery. And there's another trick that we use, and you can see again on these videos, that the train enters these areas and leaves by geographic features. At one area near the fruit terminal, there's an orchard, and the skyline bumps around there. That's to basically disguise a column, but if you look closely, you can see the column sticking above the layout, the support column for our house. But that forms a transition. That's a scenic transition. And your mind just says, oh yeah, this is natural. You don't even think about it as a scenic transition. At the other end, there's that tunnel the train goes through. Now, the train goes into the tunnel, and the train comes out of the tunnel. But there's nothing that means that's the same tunnel. Okay, that is a transitional point to another part of scenery that's going to be the town of Warrenville Junction. Okay, and there are a number of these as you go around the layout, and as you start to look at these, you can spot them, and you can see, oh, okay, this is taking your attention away from the fact that if you step back from it, you could see the whole layout, but you're not paying attention to the layout. And this is further helped by advances in control, digital command control, that allow you to walk around with your train as you're operating it, to literally be the engineer, be the brakeman with the train, okay, instead of staying in one corner of the room and watching your trains go around in a circle and seeing the whole layout. The realism is greatly enhanced by walk-around control, which is why everybody in the hobby's gone to it, even on small 4x8 foot layouts, because it puts you more in the scene. And getting back to 4x8 foot layouts for a moment, you can even apply this to a 4x8 foot layout. You can create transitional areas, and many people have done on 4x8 foot layouts, and very successfully, to create this sense of much larger space. So when you look at the scenery on a layout, realize you're looking at glimpses, and while your mind is saying, oh, this is continuous railroad, well, no, it is, but it isn't, because you're moving from scene space to scene space, and we have these transitional zones that allow you to get from one to the other. So when you build scenery, it's always handy to remember these kind of things, that you can play these tricks that people who've built stage sets and movie sets have known for decades, if not centuries, to create a sense of place in a condensed area, and then another sense of place which may be hundreds of miles away, right next to it, or by a quick change of scene props, which is essentially the same thing. And in fact, it's interesting if you learn to discipline yourself to look at a lot of movie and television productions. If you look carefully, oftentimes things creep into the edge of a scene that really don't belong there, either historically or geographically, but they know that you're going to be focused on the characters, on what's going on between the characters, the interaction, and your attention fades off very quickly. And in this case, in the model railroad, the character is the trains, and the scenery the trains is moving through at the moment, which establishes a sense of place. So that's a little bit about the philosophy of scenery, which really helps when you understand this kind of visual relationships, how we perceive things as humans as opposed to how we see them. We perceive the things that we have attention on. We may see many other things, but our brain just disregards it because that's not really what we're interested in. And what you're about is creating a sense of place that will hold people's interest. So with that, let's talk more about building the basic scenery. Okay, it's a couple days later since our geomorphology session, and the examples of some model railroaders and how they approach scenery and what it does for their layouts, whether they're modeling a real section of a real railroad or a fictitious railroad in a real geography, or a real railroad in a fictitious geography, with all different flavors there. Or in the case of John Allen, a fictitious railroad in a fictitious geography. And so today I'm going to talk about how he actually built the underlying scenery, the foreground scenery, the landform is what we're really talking about here. And I've got a lot of graphics to go through today to step you through this process. And the first couple images, are how I built the basic zero level elevation. Think of it as the true form of the earth underneath all this. And you can see here there are two big sections of 2-inch XPS that I cut out to shape to fit in this area, and you can see it in these pictures. And these are going to form the zero reference elevation, the basic elevation of the land, and we're going to go above and below that zero reference elevation. And this kind of goes to an old mapping and surveying technique when we establish a local datum, that we call it. It's a vertical and a horizontal reference point, and it's not really tied to the earth, it's tied to an absolute zero or absolute 0 point at that basis. In the surveying terms, they use this dot zero, and so they pick a point to start the survey, and that's dot zero. And there's a little bit of amusing history behind this. When the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad built, and the Moffett Line Railroad built the cutoff that enabled them to get in just 40 miles to get from out in the Rockies in the west of Denver directly into Denver via the Moffett route, the Moffett Tunnel, the starting point for the survey on the west end was dot zero. And that actually eventually became the name of the town. There is a dot zero Colorado, or dot zero Colorado, that gets its name actually from what the surveyors did when they surveyed the route. And when they ran it to the other end, onto the 40 miles of what became known as the dot zero cutoff, they had a town of Arestad, which they made a name for, which is actually a dot zero spelled backwards. Well, today Arestad is actually Bond, Colorado. But so this is my own dot zero elevation, and what I'm showing here, and those two graphics, were the panels that I used to make the base elevation for the terrain. And the next picture shows, next couple images show risers that I put in to position those panels of 2-inch XPS to the 0 point elevation. And those are the styrofoam or the XPS pieces I cut out and glued to the risers on the L girder benchwork, to which I glued the base level XPS foam. And you can see those there around both sides, and you can see the backdrop that was completed beyond it. And once I had those in, I cemented using the foam compatible adhesive the two panels, and you can see the two panels here in the next two graphics and how they're mated up. And I actually, if you notice in these two graphics, you'll see a little bit of a fillet that I didn't have quite enough length in the 8-foot long pieces of XPS to reach all the way around the curve, so I had to actually fill in a little bit of fillet there to bring it right up to the curve of the track. And so that it's all laid in there, and that makes it ready to start building my terrain. And you can see I've got a can of Kills or paint sitting on there. It helps to add a little bit of weight. Since I've got several cans of paint down here, and once I had the glue set on the risers on these next graphics, I just set cans of paint. And then I went in, as this next graphic shows, and put up the drop cloth to protect my backdrop, which is the thin plastic drop cloth, and also went in and I had a whole lot of colored images I printed out on my color laser printer of the terrain that I'm going to be modeling, and I hung these up or clipped them up with paper clips on the backdrop so that I could see constantly as I was working what it is I'm working towards, to keep it fresh in my memory, to capture the vision of the landscape. And so once I got that down, that enabled these to start paneling, start putting in the panels. And one of the things I had to do at this point also because it's the front edge of the scenery. And these next couple graphics, I'm showing in here the installation of the foreground, the fascia. And the first thing I did in this first graphic was put in holders to hold the fascia to the level I wanted on the risers, so it matched the risers, and so it didn't dip below them, and also to be able to bend the fascia board to the curves, because this is all curved that's going through, reverse curves and everything else. And this is what these plywood pieces with these little cleats in front of them help me do that. And this next graphic shows I've positioned the board where I wanted it, and using the holders to hold the board up to the cleats, so I could screw them directly to the cleats. And this next graphic also shows another view of doing that same thing. I'm using these holders to hold them up. And once I did that, I was able to go in and then cut a profile in the fascia board. And you can see in this graphic here where I've got panels of XPS propped up there, you can just see a little bit of the profile of the fascia board, and you'll see more of that later when I talk about it. But talking about these panels of the XPS, what I've been doing here is, because I had to go around a curve and I wanted to be able to build up layers of the XPS, I essentially cut a strip about 18 inches wide of the XPS, 8 feet long, and then gored it made basically trapezoidal sections out of it that when I put them edge to edge to edge would match the radius of the curve. So I didn't have to be cutting more curved pieces of XPS and having a lot of wastage of XPS. I could do this very efficiently. And so I went in and cut these pieces, and in the next graphic you can see another shot. See how they're trapezoids, these pieces of XPS, and they're stacked there, and you can see them stacked up. And then I went in and essentially started building up the terrain. And notice I've got blue painter's tape protecting the track too, because I don't want to this is going to get messy, and I didn't want to do anything either mechanically disturb the track or anything. And I also had removed the drop cloth at the moment as I was doing this, because I wanted to get the lay of the land that I was building to make sense with what was on the backdrop. And so you can see this next section here where I've actually put in the panels, and there's another graphic showing arranging the panels. And then I glued them with the plastic compatible adhesive, and at this point the glue is setting, and I've actually cut them to the rough shape. Now things are going to start to get really messy, because as I said, when you start working with this stuff, it gets crumbs of XPS all over the place. And you can see that in this next graphic. There's pieces there. And one of the things I did to also reconcile the terrain to the fascia board is I traced the profile of the fascia board. And you can see the fascia board has been cut up and down to show the unevenness of the terrain, and to extend that onto the layers of XPS, I essentially traced across from the top level of the fascia board onto the XPS to get the profile of the land that I wanted. And this is another couple shots here. You can see the mess. You just have to get in there with your sure form, and as I said in the previous introduction, I used a $2 steak knife, I used paring knives, I used sure forms of various type. It's just pick up the right tool that works, and you just keep whittling away at this stuff until you get the profile that you want. And that's what I was doing in this couple graphics. Now you can see this graphic here shows now that I've gotten it smooth to the area where I wanted, I had to get into the next step, which was to use plastic foam compatible adhesive to glue down nylon window screen. And this nylon window screen is really going to form the base of the land surface that I'm constructing. And you can see the glue there, and it comes up through the window screen. It's messy, it gets all over the place, but you can see that the window screen is glued down to the form, and now you're starting to see the gentle slopes of the hills starting to come out, because that's what the window screen is filling in. You don't have to get it perfect when you're profiling the layers of XPS. That's not the purpose. You're getting the basic shape there. And the window screen is what's really going to give you the real true shape of the terrain. And by the way, I'm working on another section of the layout currently, and I'm using a slightly different technique, and we'll get into that some episodes down the road. This next graphic shows one of the things you have to start considering at this point, which is where you're going to put buildings, because you have to allow for the kind of terrain that'll be compatible with a building being built on it. And you also have to make allowances for the fact that there's no such thing as truly level ground, and you can see this model of Ben's Mercantile that I built. I've got it sitting there shimmed on some thin XPS, and I'm positioning it, and because I want it to look like a building that was really built on that site and not a model building that somebody just stuck down on the terrain. So that's one of the things you do at this point, is get your buildings positioned. And there's another graphic here that shows the Ben's Mercantile, where it is presently situated, but before any of the work was done on the terrain. And you can see stuck in there a paring knife that I used to carve this. So this is how we build the basic terrain. And in the next episode, I'll get into what do you do once you got this done, because then you start working on some really interesting stuff, which is making terrain look like terrain. So with that, I will end this episode and get ready to produce episode number 19. Okay, this is the first stage where I'm really working on the three-dimensional foreground scenery on the layout. Now, in the graphics that you've seen, or I'll show you here, that I've already glued all these slabs of extruded polystyrene XPS in place, and I'm starting to shape them. And you notice a couple of things right off the bat. Remember I said it's going to get messy? Well, here's the mess. Okay, all these bits of extruded foam that have come out all over the place here. And what I'm doing right now is I'm basically doing the first step, the first what I call subtractive step in making the scenery, taking off stuff, because you're going to put more on than what you're going to need, and you need to start shaping stuff. So you build up this big pile of foam, and then you start working on it and shaping it down and gradually shaping it. But the first cut through this is to basically get my clearance for the track. Now notice something here. I've put blue painter's tape over the track to protect it. And in a moment, I'm going to fold down the plastic drop cloth here to protect the background scenery. But right now what I'm doing is I'm shaping the outer profile of the inside portion of the scenery from the track. When this is shaped, then I'm going to work on the outer portion here between the fascia and the viewer. But right now I'm just basically doing the crude shaping to make sure I have clearance away from the track. Now how I do that is, this is going to look really crude, but a really aggressive drywall saw that's meant to punch through the drywall. It's got a good aggressive tooth to it. And also I'm using this saw, which has a similar aggressive tooth, for longer reaches. I'm going to use this in a little bit when I start doing some more contouring on here. But right now I'm using this drywall saw so I can work a bit of time to work my way around this. Another thing I need to point out is I'm right-handed, okay, and there's a natural direction for working this, and that's why I'm starting from the leftmost portion and working around, so I can work around right-handed, and I'm comfortable. If I was going the other direction, I'd be working left-handed, and that's not a comfortable position for me. It seems like a simple thing, but really in terms of making your work easier and being able to control what you're getting, is working right-handed is how they do this. After I get through this initial shaping, I'm going to come through with my little portable vacuum cleaner and clean up this mess. But right now what I have to do is make sure that you can see here, this is leaning out over the track. I want to get the basic curvature. There's a lot more that's going to be whittled off of this, but I got to start from a basic curvature of this, and then I can start profiling and doing more delicate work. So for right now, I'm going to keep sawing and vacuuming and turning this down to get the curvature that I want in the scenery. Okay, I've finished rounding the outer edge of the scenery on the inside side of the track, and a couple little things I'm going to point out here just doing this. One of the things I want to do is make sure that I have gotten a vertical clearance all the way around, so that nothing protruding the scenery was close to the edge of rolling stock or anything. And to do that, I just basically took my combination square and set it so it was level in this end, just resting it on top of the track, I can see whether this is going to intersect. And you can see right here there's a little bit of a protrusion, but that's going to get cut off. The next thing I'm going to do is put additional tape protection on the track because I don't want to screw that up. And then I'm going to put the drop cloth down behind this, the layers of foam that I've built up to protect the backdrop. And then I'm going to go through and start sketching where I want to cut in. And essentially what I'm going to have to do here is sketch out where there's going to be more vertical faces and more sloped faces, because you'll always have these tailless piles of rubble that falls off of vertical faces and accumulates, and that's very characteristic of any kind of a cut through hilly terrain. And I'm going to make vertical cuts where I want to position those, and then that's going to be done on the basis of rough outlines that I'm going to draw on the face here, so I can be sure I know where I want to do things. And once I do the vertical face, I'm going to take out whatever depth I want of that vertical face, take that off, again making a lot more crumbs of expanded polystyrene. And then I will, once I've cut that in, then I'm going to work on some of the slope work, and you'll start to see hills take shape. And again, working from left to right because I'm right-handed, worked my way around the layout. So when I come back, I hope to have something to show you here about that step in the process.